next week I'm going to bring my Nikes. The Gospel according to St. Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. And when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. And then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And he said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated, and let us pray. Father God in heaven, we thank you for this day of worship. We thank you for this day that you bring us together to reflect and meditate on the meaning of life the way you meant it to be. To sit at the foot of the cross and to be humble in all things in all ways. Lord God, especially as we gather this day in the midst of a hurricane coming to the United States, let us remember the humility that you speak of and for which you died, to serve and not just be served, and our quest to take care of ourselves, but also to take care of one another. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Some of you may have seen that book entitled The Second Book of Insults. Well, evidently the first book was so successful that the publisher thought it deserved a sequel. Well, I confess that it sounds like an enjoyable read. It is in that grand tradition that certain people in certain kinds of comedy use what is called that technique called a put-down. The English are renowned for their put-down tradition. It's like the story told in the book about Bernard Shaw, who sent 2 tickets to his latest play opening in London to Churchill with this note. Here are 2 tickets for opening night of my new play. One for you and one for your friend. That is, I have one. And Churchill sent the tickets back with this note. I cannot attend opening night. Send me 2 tickets for the next night, if there is one. Like I said, the English certainly are masters at put-downs. Unfortunately, put-downs are not only rooted in the tradition of comedy. The put-downs that we have heard by both major presidential candidates and their parties this past election season have not always been funny or comical. Actually, some of them are absolutely disgusting. The name-calling, the character assassinations that has gone on has not only been offensive to adults, but has contaminated the young minds of children in their formative years. And believe it or not, the tradition of put-downs is evident in the Bible also, especially those put-downs which were often voiced by bullying emperors who pushed and shoved the Jewish people around. Well, I suppose wherever you go, there is the concern of status, the rich versus the poor. The poor put down the rich, and the rich put down the poor. F. Scott Fitzgerald, American classic, The Great Gatsby, maybe some of you have read that book, reveals that status keeping is part of the American way. He states that Americans especially have created their own system of class. Status in American society is not gained by property or family, but by money. It is money that separates Americans from one another, it seems. And I guess every institution has some formal or informal structure and hierarchy with titles and salaries and privileges, such as somebody getting the corner office or having a special designated parking place and so on. Sports writer Ted Leitner once reported that Ted Turner, owner of the Atlanta Braves, has his own private parking space at Turner Stadium in Atlanta with a sign that reads, "Don't even think about it." You see, that is what wealth can bring you. That kind of power, and of course, your own special designated parking space. And even churches, I'm sorry to say, are sometimes ranked according to status. It is everywhere, ubiquitous. Status consciousness. Every institution, every grouping of people will manifest it, and in today's gospel, Jesus condemns it. Now, I want you to look again in today's gospel. Jesus is a guest at this really fancy dinner. His host is a ruler, a Pharisee, no less. And it's a kind of supper that would have been covered by the New York Times or perhaps the Washington Post. All these celebrities were there, and it had that kind of guest list. And the host was a prominent man in the community. People looked up to him, paid attention to him. And so this man invited his buddies to dinner to meet the newest celebrity in Israel, Jesus, the man from Nazareth, who had gained notoriety as a great preacher, a healer, and performer of miracles. Thousands of people came out to hear this celebrity named Jesus. And everyone at the event that day had heard of him, but probably very few of them had taken the time to actually hear him. In any event, it was a nice affair. It was probably a backyard kind of event, catered along the water's edge. And after the meal, the host got up and gave Jesus a most gracious introduction, and then he asked Jesus to say a few words. I think he probably regretted asking Jesus to speak. Well, here's what Jesus said. I noticed the way that you all maneuvered all your seats at the table this afternoon. You can get away with that here. But I'm telling you, when you were invited to a marriage feast, do not sit at the place of honor lest a more important person arrives. And the host has to come over to you in front of everyone and say to you, give up your place. Instead, when you are invited, go to the lowest place, so that when the host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. You see, today's parable is sometimes actually referred to as the judgment parable. And here's why. When Jesus says the word, when you are invited to a marriage feast, we recognize that term marriage feast was one of those metaphors throughout the Bible that refers to the kingdom of God. And Jesus is pictured as the bridegroom. And when the kingdom comes, it will be like a great banquet, a marriage feast, if you will. And there are other parables about banquets and feasts using that same metaphor in the Bible. The parables Jesus told about banquets are usually concerned about who's invited and who comes in and who doesn't come and who gets in and who doesn't get in. And their purpose is to give us a glimpse of the end times. It says, what you are counting on now, don't count on then. And what you think is important now, don't count on that being important later. And all this jockeying for position seating, all this self-aggrandizement, all this wanting to be in the right places, all this wanting to be number one, being on top, Jesus is saying, none of that's going to count. And that's why you're living on earth. Think again when you come to the kingdom of heaven. The only thing that counts in the kingdom is humility. For at the banquet, at that time, the appropriate place for all of us is at the foot of the table. At that banquet, in that kingdom, the appropriate place for everybody is at the foot of the cross. The seating place of humility. Now the fact is, nobody knows what's going to happen at the banquet. And I, for one, I get a kick out of people who seem to think they know how this thing called heaven someday is going to roll out for everyone. And sometimes some of these folks seem to suggest they know who exactly is going to heaven and who's going to hell, as if they were privy to the guest list. as if they knew beforehand who was invited, as if they knew the seating arrangements, including who's going to be at the head of the table and next to Jesus. And one other unfortunate thing that I've observed sometimes is this. Folks who pretend to know it all seem to suggest that the people who are going to heaven are the people who agree with them. And the people who are going to hell are the people who don't agree with them. And sorry to say, some of these people will often tell you that they're Bible-believing folks. But you can usually tell that they really haven't read the entire Bible for what it really says. I mean, when you read the Bible, it's crystal clear. Nobody knows. That's the way it should be. We need to let God handle his business. Amen?
Amen.
We don't need to get in the business of judging. We're about the business of loving. The only thing for certain we know is this. There will be surprises, sisters and brothers. There will be surprises. And as that spiritual song puts it, everybody's talking about heaven, but ain't going there. But today's gospel that comes to us from Luke does give us the best clue about how anybody can go to heaven. And that clue is the humble will make it. For everyone who is humbles himself or herself, will be exalted, and everyone who exalts him or herself will be humbled. That's it. I know some of you remember reading the parable of the goats, the sheep and the goats, found in Matthew's gospel. And the most significant part of that story is surprises. Those that get rejected are surprised. What is even more significant are those who were not expecting to get in. They were surprised to find out that they got in. These humble folks who were not focused on what's in it for me, they were focused on helping others in need. Really good lesson for us during a time of hurricane, don't you think? And those folks, they got into heaven. So the clues are there, and they're consistent. The counsel that you should humble yourself, that I should humble myself, occurs 10 times in the Gospel of Luke. As many times as loving your neighbor. So if you want to ensure your salvation, stop thinking about what's in it for me. And start thinking about what's in it for somebody else. That is the pattern by which Jesus lives his life. And so should it be the pattern of your life and my life. St. Paul admonished the church of Philippi, and us, for that matter, in those words that come to mind today from Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 to 11. I want to share those words with you and really take them to heart because they're meaningful words, especially in light of today's gospel. St. Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others better than yourselves. Let each one of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient even to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave himself the name above all names, so that the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess on earth and heaven, that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God our Father. Sisters and brothers, the bottom line is this. This is what Jesus is saying to you and me today. If you are coming to church with the idea, what's in it for me? And with that notion, I'm going to go to church now and then, give a little bit of money, do a few good things every day to get me into heaven someday. It may be time for you to exit out the door and go home right now. But I want you to look at your gospel again. Turn to page 12 and read verse 11 with me, please. I want us to read verse 11 together. Let's read that together on page 12. Ready? For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. sisters and brothers, if you are one of those folks who are willing to empty yourself and humble yourself to serve, not just today, but work towards that kind of pattern in the way you live your life every day. If you are one of those folks who are willing to serve and not just be served, if you're one of those folks who are not worried about your position in life, or whether you're sitting at the back or in front of the altar, if you're one of those folks who are willing this very day to get on the path of life that will help you take on the same mind of Christ, welcome, sister and brother, to the banquet table. Jesus is not only saving a place for you, he already has placed your name on the reservation list to live with him today, now, and forevermore. And as God's people together we say, Amen. Congregation, please rise. And may the peace of God which passes all human understanding keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus our Lord.